see that. And then they say, back then in medieval Europe, okay, people were not like us. And I looked at him and said, people were different. They had good shapes and bodies. They could run and swim, for example, for 10 kilometers, not like us. And I looked at him and said, I can swim 12 kilometers in open water. And then, you can? Yeah, I can. You see, I can. I trained for that under 2 coaches for years, right? And then there are people who can run for marathon. There are people who do. And then I told him, you say back then they could go with an armor. I know American military guys who are on mission. They have 24, let's say in kilos, equipment, and they go for miles and miles and miles. So what is the difference between that and a medieval knight? So the comparison is between medieval knight and him. But you cannot say we, all people around, are like that. For example, when I go, you know that, you go to a wrestling tournament. The US is as big in wrestling as Russia and Iran are. You see the bodies of these people. They look like Greek gods, right? And then you just say, God, these guys train day in, day out for this. This body doesn't fall from heaven, or you're not born with it, right? And then you come here and then you hear these stories. I always say, you only hear it in historical, how can I say it, swordsmanship, many circles, because people, there are 2 things. You don't have time to do that, fine. But don't say back then they were so physically fit, not like us. Yeah, they were as physically fit as a professional UFC fighter, as a long distance swimmer, as a wrestler, as whatever, football player, basketball player, or firearms, as you said, competitor. They are as fit as these guys. But, but they make overgeneralization, that, I cannot do sport. I cannot do this sword, this one, a free flow for 3 minutes. I run out, I gas out. And back then, how did they fight so long? And I look at him and I say, well, maybe you should do something for your stamina. Or, that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think in the modern age, we live in, it's a paradox, because we live in an age where we have some of the highest performing athletes in all of history, where records for sports are beaten every year. All time records are beaten every year. What is it? Back in the 4-minute mile? I think it was back in the 1960s. The 4-minute mile, it might have been a little bit earlier than that, but for a long time the 4-minute mile was considered unattainable. And then all of a sudden now, if you're a serious runner who wants to be competitive at the national, international level, you have to be able to do a 4-minute mile. But that's at the same time as having people who are able to live the most sedentary possible existence. So we have a very big disparity of having both some of the highest performing athletes in history, but also some of the most sedentary people in history on the other side of the spectrum. In the military, I was a company commander for a initial training for the United States Army, and the 2 biggest health problems that we have for at least, or had at the time, for people joining is bone density issues and plantar fasciitis for kids coming from high school, and both of those are inactivity, physical inactivity related issues, where their feet are just not, they don't have the stabilizing muscles in their feet to avoid plantar fasciitis for a while, and they just haven't been putting in the kind of nutrition and having the kind of physical activity to allow to be able to go from a sedentary lifestyle to an athletics lifestyle without having pretty big issues. So yeah, you're right that you can't cast judgment from a completely sedentary perspective. I think that you can be an athlete and be able to understand martial arts like how they at least understood it from a physical perspective. That's an attainable goal. That's not something that's you have to have a time machine in order to achieve.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to hear that from you, because I get really despaired when I hear all these stories. Back then they were different. I always say, let's compare one thing, which for example, please compare any competitive martial art competitions, right? Compare wrestling today, wrestling 20 years ago, 30 years ago, full contact karate, also point karate, any type of competition, boxing, or okay, we know that in heavyweight sometimes, okay, but that's another thing. But when we look at the athletic level of all full contact martial arts, let's stick to full contact martial arts. You see how, and when I look at Kyokushin, I don't want to disrespect our colleagues 30 years ago in full contact bare knuckle. You watch them today, they are much more athletic, the techniques, the range, because everything evolves. Right. And then I always tell these people in historical martial arts, in every, in wrestling, I was involved, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in MMA, everything you say, Kyokushin Karate, Muay Thai, you see a progress constantly over 10 years, 20 years. You see so much progress. And how could it be that back then they were so good, you know what I mean, in their body or their fighting, and we are not? It doesn't simply make sense. You can say back then they fight with sharps, but that's not the only thing. That's also aesthetic body. I fully agree with you, which no one talks about. No one talks about that. Very good. Thank you very much. And let us go, if you wish, to talk about your time in military, and if you want to share something with our viewers.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. So like I said earlier, I started out doing the Army ROTC, a Reserve Officer Training Corps commissioning program in college, where so went through that, and unlike the Army enlisted system, where you get the job that you sign up for with the recruiter, as an officer, you have to bid. Basically, there's a bidding process where you whichever branch you can be in, and by branch I mean like infantry, armor, aviation, that sort of stuff. So I wanted to be an infantry officer, but I ended up becoming a chemical officer, which is short for nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological. Let's see. So CBRN is the acronym. So chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive. So training at those things, that was my job. So I started out as that, and I went to Fort Hood, which is in Central Texas, and decided, and I really wanted to deploy to Afghanistan, or Afghanistan or Iraq at that point in time, because that was, I joined because I wanted to deploy. I wanted to, go on adventures and, and pull triggers and do all that stuff. So I kind of begged to get assigned to a unit that was getting deployed, and I did. And when I got to Afghanistan, I was in a military intelligence brigade, and I spoke with one of my leaders whose job was to assign me to whichever position I was going to be in. And I told him, as much, that I wanted to be out on mission. And he gave me the role of being the radio platoon leader in a what was called the Long Range Surveillance Infantry Company, or LRS. And that's a specialized reconnaissance infantry unit. It doesn't exist anymore. And what their job is, they're mostly Ranger qualified, and have a lot of different schools. And their job is basically to go forward of the forward line of troops with the FLOT for a battle, and to gain deep intelligence into any given situation, into the enemy or a location. So I was this chemical officer, this chemical brand new lieutenant, no experience in the military, and I was assigned to a unit, an elite unit full of Ranger NCOs and officers, and it was a hard process for me. I was basically hazed probably every day, and really it was very difficult right off the bat, but eventually I got some very good advice by my commanding officer, saying that you have to be good at something. You have to be better at something than everybody else. That's if you want to be valuable, that's what you have to do. And I noticed that the soldiers in my unit really didn't have a lot of enthusiasm for working with the Afghans that were assigned to us. We had a platoon of Afghan soldiers. This was in Spin Boldak in Afghanistan, which is far southeast, basically in Kandahar province. You take the highway to the border with Pakistan, and there's a town called Shaman there on the border. And on the other side of Shaman, there's Spin Boldak, and that border crossing, that's the southernmost of the three main border crossings in Afghanistan. That border crossing is called the Wesh border crossing. And so my FOB, Spin Boldak, my forward operating base, that was where we were, and ostensibly working with that border crossing and then the area around it. So I noticed that the people in my unit really weren't very enthused about working with the Afghan border patrol soldiers that we had with us. And I decided that I wanted to learn how to work with them and to really become their liaison and to help train them to be good partners for us on mission. So I asked my commanding officer to become to create a training program for them, and he agreed. So I got a bunch of volunteers and created a training program for the Afghan border patrol soldiers that we had, and I spent most of every day with the Afghans. I had my radio platoon, but with the radio platoon, my radio men were mostly divvied out to the other platoons at any point in time. So I really didn't have much opportunity to be much of a leader to them because I'd never had them really in one place at any point in time. So I really delved into working with the Afghans and loved it. And really, I think I enjoyed my deployment so much that when we came back, I volunteered to go back again. I said, I had some fun back at home. And then I said, can I go back? And unfortunately, they didn't have any place for me, any opportunities for someone with my job and my rank going forward. So I was back in the United States, spent some time with a nuclear, biological, and chemical unit. And then, like I said, got out where I was in the private sector as both going to school and then as a technical manager in the chemical industry, and then came back in. My wife is also in the military, so she didn't want to go to the civilian side at that point in time. So I decided that I'd come back in, and my opportunity was as a human resources officer. So now I'm a human resources officer. I've been the HR guy for a battalion. I've been the commanding officer for an initial entry unit for human resources clerks, and I've been on the Army writing team for the human resources field manual that the Army has. And now I'm working as the HR manager for a recruiting unit. So that's kind of my experiences in the military with a broad stroke. But I can talk more about my time in Afghanistan if you'd like to.
Yes,
do you have any specific questions?
Yes. How did you? You were in a real, let's say, hot area, Kandahar, right? Could you tell us how it was? Yes, please.
Yeah. So on one hand, Kandahar, and I know you've talked about this with some of the other veterans. Kandahar is in Pashtunistan. The Taliban is a Pashtun identity organization, probably, at least as far as when it was founded. They probably aspire to more now, but that's really the heart of where Pashtuns are from, and so on one hand, yes, it did have the potential to be dangerous, but like any kind of military conflict, there are places also where both sides kind of don't want to be fighting in, and one of those areas was the border crossing, where people, I think the people that we were fighting at the time were, I think they were mostly under orders not to get into unnecessary conflict near the border crossing, near the west border crossing, because they didn't want to be arousing undue attention to their movement in that area. So on one hand, interdicting the men and weapons and money and other stuff coming across the border was our priority. On the other hand, in a lot of ways, they didn't want to be getting in unnecessary fights, at least in so critical of an area. And I think they also realized at the time that if they got captured instead of killed, they would probably be released within the next few weeks, rather than if they shot at us, they would probably be they would more likely than not die. One nice thing about being in an elite unit in a military intelligence brigade like what we were in was that we were able to risk mitigate on a very high level. So whenever we went on a mission, we had what I would consider to be pretty overwhelming resources. We had UAVs that were able to be seeing where we can't see, and we had interpreters. We had just so many resources that if someone did decide to fight with us, it would be very unlikely that anything other than they would just be overwhelmingly taken down. That being said, we did get into a pretty bad ambush near the end of our deployment where our guys were lit up pretty bad. Fortunately, no one died, but we got some people who were shot up pretty bad. So I think on one hand it was hot, and that's definitely in the homeland of the Taliban. But on the other hand, I think there was a lot of interest from both parties just not to be getting in unnecessary fights in that area. So it was kind of a paradox. I think in a lot of ways, when I was there from 2011 to 2012, the most hot area I think was in the desert to the west, like in Herat, and toward more toward the west side of Afghanistan. I think at least when I was there, it was trying to keep things a little bit quieter. But that being said, there was still a lot of really interesting things to learn about the dynamic, about the power dynamic in the area. About learning how it was really run by kind of strong men in that area in Afghanistan, probably across Afghanistan as a whole. There was a guy who really ran Kandahar. His name was Abdul Razik, or Raziq, at least with the English transliteration. So, and then we had another guy who was the head of our area, and I'm trying to think of his name. He went by Haji, but he hadn't actually completed the Hajj. That was just something that was just kind of a term. Who's gonna tell him, hey, you don't get to use that title because you haven't done the Hajj. Along with other strong men, but they're all dead now, and it's kind of a who's who rotating of who's in power at any point in time in that area. But it was really interesting seeing how very different the world is over there, but also seeing the remnants of old civilizations, seeing all these forts that had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there were even villages that we went through who they had only seen Americans maybe once in the whole time of the War on Terror. So it was kind of an alien experience being there.
Of course, because there are so many villages, you never know, where someone goes or where you go and get your food in the country. Absolutely, that's what we tend to forget, because normally we get strategic points, but then there are so many other places, right? As you mentioned, that's right. They have
and then seeing the dynamics of language and culture as well. So like I believe Miles was talking about learning Pashto or Pashto, and then. But one thing that was interesting in my area was that Pashto is what they spoke on the day to day. But if someone had pretensions of being someone who was educated or important, they would use what little Dari they knew to like kind of intersperse Dari words to make themselves to seem to show that I'm somewhat of importance in education, because what is it let me give it for instance in Pashto, I think thank you is paka in Pashto, but in Dari it's tashkur. And so they'd say tashkur instead of paka, and that would give some indication that they had an opinion of themselves that they were someone who was important.